So our next speaker is Rindon Kundu, who is Assistant Professor of English at Sri Sri University, Cuttack, India. After undergraduate study at BKC College in Kolkata, then master's degrees in English, Comparative Literature and Translation Studies from respectively the University of Calcutta, Jadavpur University in Kolkata and the University of Hyderabad. Rindon worked as a research assistant at the University of Technology, Sydney, before returning to Jadavpur to pursue a PhD in comparative literature as junior, then senior research fellow. Rindon is treasurer of the Comparative Literature Association of India and South Asian regional director of the International Association Eco-Translation Research. Earlier this year, Rindon was appointed founder director of the Sri Sri Centre for Translation and Interpreting Studies at Sri Sri University. He's convening a panel on the ecological turn in translatology at the IARTIS conference in Barcelona next month. Welcome, Rindon. Rindon's title today is Nature's Tale from the East, Asian Tryst with Eco-Translatology.
Thank you, Duncan, for this brilliant introduction. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm sharing my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The process of translation and the status of translator has been delineated from numerous viewpoints by different theoreticians over a span of several centuries. I consider myself extremely fortunate that I have been given a chance to share a platform, although virtual, with some of the stalwarts who have outlined definitions of the process as well as defined the maker of the process. Today, we all have assembled to share our thoughts in response to the significant publication by Professor Michael Cronin on eco-translation. My paper titled Nature's Tale from the East, Asian Tryst with Eco-Translatology has been divided into 3 sections, not necessarily connected to each other, but aimed to validate possibilities of future research in the direction set by Professor Cronin and other theorists in this field like Professor Gengshan Ho and his idea of eco-translatology, and Professor Jiangjong Zhu and his concept of translation ecology. Coming from India, a country where almost the entire population is polylingual, the process of translation is organically associated with our everyday experience. It is such an inevitable part of our existence that translation as an act was never approached theoretically by Indian scholars until very recently, where the scholars have either looked at it from the linguistic perspective or cultural standpoint. Going beyond these 2 approaches, I am trying to develop an ecological model of looking at the practice of translation in India as it has organically born, grown, and developed through adoption and rejection of the Western epistemological understanding of translation. Although this is a work in progress and I am in the initial stage of conceptualization, I thought this will be a great opportunity to bring my ideas to stalwarts from across the world and garner their ideas and criticism about it. So the first section of my presentation deal with fluidity of translation. I will talk about cell membrane, fluid mosaic model, and cellular signaling. And through these apparently irrelevant topics outside the field of translation studies, I will try to connect biological model of cell structure and the signaling process with the course of translation and the figure of translator. thus try to explore the possibility of building alternative modes of translation through conceptualizing a biological model of translation. The concept of expanding the notion of translation beyond interlinguistic translation and explore alternative models of translation has been hypothesized by Kobus Marai in his recent work. We all know that the plasma membrane protects the cell from its existential environment, mediates cellular transport, and transmits cellular signals. On the other hand, we are also aware of the fact how translation through enabling effective communication between people around the world serves as a courier for the transmission of knowledge and protects cultural heritage, which is essential to the existence of marginal community in the global village. The plasma membrane protects intercellular components from the extracellular environment. Moreover, it mediates cellular processes by regulating the materials that enter and exit the cell and carries markers that allow cells to recognize one another and can transmit signals to other cells via receptors. Similarly, the translator, acting like a plasma membrane between exterior linguistic cultural environment and interior linguistic cultural environment, thus behaving like a body standing on the border zone, as well as transmitter receptor who is regulating the entry and exit of language, culture, socio-political behavior codified in linguistic message. By cell signaling, a message from the external environment is received by the cell, and that message is relayed by cell signaling cascade, ultimately leading to transcription of the receptive gene, followed by the transmission into a protein, which is ultimate expression of the message received by the cell. Now, Larry D. Fry and Michael Editin experimented to verify the lateral movement of membrane proteins by fusing mouse and human cells with mouse-specific and human-specific membrane proteins. The experiment was done in a controlled environment, intersecting the Sendai virus as an external agent, which helps to produce a hybrid cell through a virus-induced infusion. This infusion is due to membrane fluidity. This historic discovery of diffusion of cell membranes under controlled conditions helped to construct a fluid mosaic model that has been derived by Singer and Nicholson, 1972, and facilitated the understanding of the importance of cell membranes surrounding all cells. Translation, too, is a channel through which different cultures flow towards each other. Languages diffuse to make new combinations. Translation, therefore, I argue, keeping the biological fluid mosaic model as lateral movement of membrane fluids is a liquefied process which can create a hybrid target text where the qualities of the source and the target passes into one another through a continuum of transformations. The primary function of the plasma membrane is to protect the cell from its surroundings, as translator sometimes also regulates the coda of the textual transfer to protect the cultural sphere of the language he or she belongs to, or have some ethical ground to protect. Composed of a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins, the plasma membrane is selectively permeable to ions and organic molecules and regulates the movements of substance in and out of the cells. Translator 2, we can study how, taking Hu's theory of selective adaptation and adaptive selection as a point of reference, selectively finds the penetrable pores in the process of translation through which he or she can mediate and regulate the process of translational movement. Translator, as argued before, acts as a body standing on the border, flexible enough to allow the flow of culture and thus shaping and reshaping the receptor language sphere. Just as plasma membranes must be very flexible in order to allow certain cells, such as red blood cells and white blood cells, to change shape as they pass through narrow capillaries, thus plays a role in anchoring the complex dynamic network of interlinking in order to provide shape to the cell. In short, if the cell is represented by a castle, the plasma membrane is the wall that provides structural safety for the building within it, regulates which people leave and enter the castle, and conveys message to and from neighboring castles. Similarly, the translator also acts as a regulator, and in certain cases, as mentioned by the polysystem theorists, it provides the shape to the receiving literature. Thus, just as the plasma membrane helps in forming the tissue and providing cell potential, the translator too form a potential literary culture and readership and helps in providing a matrix for a potential market for the emerging literature through translation. According to Gengchen Hu, eco-translatology is an interaction and interrelation between translational text, translator, and translational eco-environment. The research trinity of the macroscopic framework of translation studies, mesoscopic system of translation theory studies, and microscopic textual production. Taking a cue from Gengchen Hu's eco-translatological model, I argue that the act of translation is a flow of meaning between languages and cultures, or more broadly, flow of corporeality of human and non-human existence throughout human history. This idea will posit translation as a fluid process which the translator attempts to control, but in reality can never be controlled or halted. Therefore, creates an illusion of control. The idea of fluidity as a quality of flowing easily and clearly, I argue, is a core idea embedded in the act of translation, which the translator, through choosing either word for word or sense for sense, a set of oppositional structures for themselves as well as for the readers, create an illusory mask of controlling the fluidity of translation. Finally, taking a cue from the interdisciplinarity between natural sciences and social sciences, I am hoping to create an alternative model of translation in terms of the fluid mosaic model to conceptualize the perpetual fluidity of translational movement. Now I move to the second section of my presentation, which I have titled Alternative Notions of Translation from the Global South. The diverse interwoven battling coexistence of different notions of translation in our planet can be approached from a comparative methodology. The geographical region that has been termed as Global South has always been considered at the receiving end of theory, with no exception in the field of translation studies. My aim is to stitch together as many substitutive views as possible from the Global South, exploring various discursive practices in the margins within South Asia, as Cronin has pointed out that the center of eco-translation is Global South. To explore the alternative notions of translation from the global south, I look at the terminologies related to translation in different Indian languages. But before going into that, let me point out the spatial nature of Western translation to point out the metaphor of body embedded in the process. While the concept of transfer has received much attention in translation studies from the context of transference of meaning from the source text to the target, the etymological root of the word translation has probably been unexplored except by Talal Asad, who critically looked at the meaning removal of a saint's body or relics from one original site to another new place. Since translate and transfer share the same etymological roots, both the acts give a hint that the text that was rendered in another language or culture was perhaps considered as holy as the bones of a saint. Therefore, the act of carrying over might have come to hold importance equivalent to that of a religious act, which, if acceptable, is holy, and if unacceptable, becomes blasphemy, and therefore amounts to debasing of the source text. This notion of removal to another place, much like that of the removal of the saints' bones and relics in the earlier periods, which I argue immediately reminds us of the idea of transmigration, which also has quite a similar meaning, the passing into another state. This similarity is further reinforced by the fact that both the word translation and transmigration, which also has quite a similar meaning, the passing into another state, this similarity is further reinforced by the fact that both the word translation and transmigration have religious connotations. Where transmigration denotes the passage of the soul after death into the body, translation signifies removal of a saint's body or relics to a new place. So the notion of movement in terms of bodily and spatial is inherent to the term translation, which thereby implies a dislocation and relocation. Therefore, it is clear that the Western idea is obsessed with the territoriality of the term, which thereby can be linked with their agenda to colonize other, and thereby translating their ethos and ideologies in the colonized land. Reproduction of the message in another land has always been laden with the weight of ideology and power of the original, the dominant or colonizer, on the translated, the dominant or colonized. Then the ideological and power turn will create the question of authenticity or fidelity in the translated text, which again can be linked with the problematic history of Bible translation. This is another idea that I have taken in from the introduction of the theme issue of Cardemos do Traducio, titled Moving Bodies Across Transland. The editors, Martha Pinto, Durate, and Carvalho, they have elaborated on the role of translators as moving bodies and translation as a cultural good or product. They have brought in three structuring axes of translation. Number one, agency, that is bodies, subjective actors. Number two, displacement, that is the word trans, and locus, the word land. Thus conceptualized transland, a descriptive concept and spatial metaphor on which all these forces mentioned above are concentrated, as well as an idea where translation flows have become a defining factor to understand movements in, out, and across a globalized world. Now, if we take the model of Euclidean geometry, the Western concept of translational act as a spatial flow can be understood clearly from a mathematical point of view. In Euclidean geometry, the term translation is defined by saying how much a point is moved to the left or right and up or down. Thus, simply means moving in a direction. If we consider the source text as a triangle, where the 3 points would be source text, author, source text, environment, with shifting the coordinates of all the points can produce target text, translator, target text, environment. An object that looks the same before and after translation may have a translational symmetry. Therefore, a translation can also be interpreted as the addition of a constant vector to every point, or as shifting the origin of the coordinate system. And the process of translation can be interpreted as a distance preserving transformation between two metric spaces. The translation scenario in India got much affected when it encountered the European epistemological understanding of the process through colonial rule. It was during this time that the colonial world saw advent of European Enlightenment knowledge through the shipping of European English books. These books were then translated into indigenous Indian languages to disseminate the knowledge among the common mass. It is during this confrontation with the English world that the Indians came across a new practice of translation that concentrated on the spatial movement than the temporal aspect of it. This practice of translation concentrating on the spatial crossover in terms two languages where the message or the information remains intact. I argue that it can be explained through this Euclidean model of geometry. Another concept relating to the practice of translation that has evolved in the West is the word adaptation, which too can be explored from an ecological perspective. Analysis of the lexical entry of the word adaptation will explore its origin from the French word adaptation, which in turn derived directly from the late Latin word adaptionem, which indicates meanings like to fit, to adjust, to adapt. Around 1670s, it has transformed into the condition of being adapted. And the connotation of modification of a thing to suit new conditions came approximately from 1790s, but the biological sense in the term was first documented in Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in the year 1859. According to James T. Coster, adaptation is the root concept that grew into Darwin's theory of natural selection. Chambers' Etymological Dictionary too has mentioned that the term adaptation, which implies the act of making suitable, the act of being suitable, the act of the state of being suitable, fitness, etc., thus brings forth a few synonymous associations to our mind. For instance, version, modification, adjustment, and accommodation. With the resultant understanding that adaptation implies adjustments made by an organism or a piece of literary work and the modifications it has to undergo in order to accommodate in an environment other than that of its origin. Adaptation, therefore, in the biological sense means the current state of being of an organism in a particular habitat or environment and to the dynamic evolutionary system that leads to the adaptation. But it is Darwin who has recognized the relationship between an organism and its environment, which was seen as a fixed relationship earlier. According to him, with the climate changing, the habitat changes, and as the habitat reshape, the organism mutates with the environment. When the environment changes, There are three things that may happen to a living organism. Number one, habitat tracking. Number two, genetic change. And number three, extinction. Of these three types, genetic change accomplishes adaptation. But I will come back to this later after exploring Indian terms relating to translational act, and will try to link this ecological aspect of translation with specific Indian terms. Now, according to systematic poetics of Indian practices of translational act, best explained in the preface of pre-colonial Indian texts written in Sanskrit and other Indian languages, there was no such spatial concept of transference of meaning like translation. Rather, a multitude of terms denoting alternative practices in peripheral spaces. Say, for example, anuvad, retelling, Rūpäntar, transplantation, Vivartanam, evolution, tarjuma, paraphrase, bhangoni, breaking, and chaya, shadow, which depicts the use of the concept in a variety of contexts, thus challenging the obligation of the interlingual nature of translation in global north. These words, anuvad from Sanskrit, Rūpäntar Sanskrit, Vivartanam Malayalam, tarjuma Urdu, bhangoni Assamese, all these terms can challenge the Western model of translation specific activity. I intend to classify here only two specific Indian terms to usher in an ecological paradigm of translation, namely Rūpäntar and Vivartanam, which denotes translation as evolution and translation as transplantation. Adopting the Indian notion of translation as Rūpäntar and Vivartanam, and combining them with the concept of eco-translatology, I would try to explore the methodologies of textual transplantation by illustrating how the locus of the text or the textual ecosystem can be transplanted from the microcosmic ecosphere and to another eco-environment, keeping the eco-linguistic texture of the target intact. Understanding of these terminologies would also challenge the universal notion of translation, taking cue from the Indian aesthetics best explained in Bharata's Natya Shastra, according to whom reconstruction of a well-known story is the higher form of creativity over original creation. And all these varied terms like Rūpäntar, Vivartanam, which are hinting towards the fact that translational activities in pre-colonial India were having the existential primacy, as the version or renditions were employing the more important position than its original form. The multiple relations of Indian Mahakavyas like Ramayana and Mahabharata in many languages of South and Southeast Asia are proving this perspective of Indian plurisemiotic practices. Rūpäntar is a translational practice of pre-colonial India, which has been equated with the concept of adaptation by the British lexicographers during the colonial time. It was constructed by combining two Sanskrit words, Rūp and Antar. The word Rūp means form and Antar means change. Therefore, Rūpäntar denotes transformation of a text and would be equivalent to the words like rendition, adaptation, and version. This means that the text has not undergone a word-for-word translation, rather it has undergone a change in the form and has been given a new shape, a translation. In Monier-Williams' Sanskrit to English dictionary, Roop, the root word of Rūpäntar, not only means form, figure, and beauty, but also contains meaning like ropa, the act of planting, the act of raising, ropana, the act of setting up, ropita, the act of planting trees, the act of planting saplings, and ropaka, the planter. In Horicharan Bandyopadhyay's Bongio Shabdakosh, a Bengali dictionary, we see a comprehensive entry of the word roop Along with the two most obvious entries like beauty and form mentioned above, he also mentions that Roop can also mention to plant, to sow. Therefore, we can excavate the organic metaphor of transplantation hidden in the term Rūpäntar. Such connotations associated with the practice of Rūpäntar bring to our mind Shelley's metaphor of transplanting the seeds to denote the process of naturalization, who in his defense of poetry has suggested the famous idea of transplanting the seed while talking of carrying across a poem from one culture to the other. According to Shelley, the words and sounds of a poem are so intricately linked that it cannot be recreated with the same effect in another language. If, using the botanic metaphor, the plant is uprooted from one soil and planted in another. What is possible otherwise is carrying the seed, according to Shelley, or the thought embedded within the poem, which can be sowed in the soil of another linguistic world. It will then be exposed to a completely new geographical world and will bear flowers and fruits possible in that part of the world. The basic difference between transplantation of seeds and plucking a plant from one soil and planting it into a different soil, as mentioned in the term Rūpäntar, is that in the first, which is what is getting translated, is the basic essence or thought and core characteristics of a text into the target culture. But in the second, the whole text with all its characteristics and essence is made to be adapted into a different cultural environment which has different demands and can nourish the thought in a different manner. Susan Bassnett, in her essay Transplanting the Seed, Poetry and Translation, suggests that translation can be thought in terms of transplanting a seed. The seed, once transplanted, flourishes in another geographical condition. According to Bassnett, the imagery Shelley uses refers to change and new growth, as opposed to the imagery of loss and decay. Similarly, the process of Rūpäntar can be located in the organic metaphor of transplantation, and the process of acculturation can be explored through the close analysis of the term. But of course, the change in the habitat will lead to the change in the biota. As Darwin puts it, and I have already mentioned before, three main things can happen to the transplanted text or the biota. Number one, habitat tracking. Number two, extinction. And number three, genetic change. The first impact, habitat tracking, can be equated with textual foreignization. The second impact, extinction, will allude to Shelley's metaphor of casting the violet into the crucible. And the third and the most important impact is genetic change, which is adaptation or Rūpäntar proper. In this case, the thought of the source text is adapted and can freely undergo necessary changes as is required in the new geographical terrain. The target text assumes a new form, shedding the older one, and is cultivated all over again according to the aesthetics of the land of the receptors. The next term, Vivartanam, can be understood from the Darwinian point of view again. The term Vivartanam literally indicates alteration or evolution, which is a derivation of the Sanskrit word Vivarta, which according to the Vedic philosophy denotes the altered representation or condition of Brahma, the ultimate reality, as a serpent in an altered represented of a rope. Vivartanam, Sanskrit alteration, Malayalam evolution, were used in pre-colonial time to convey the oblique and diversified idea of translational act as practiced in pre-European Indian literatures. In accordance with the Darwinian paradigm, an organism sustains and evolves with a changing environment due to its natural selection, and Darwin's principle of the survival of the fittest is heavily based on biological evolution and adaptation of organism through natural selection, which can be equated with this term. Now, keeping these two terminological explorations as a point of departure, I argue that we should focus on building a new theoretical discourse system of translation studies based on ecological construction in the global south, especially in the context of India. I argue that a careful reading of the dialectic between Rūpäntar as transplantation and Vivartanam as evolution can further offer crucial insights into the process of acculturation through exploring different layers of botanic metaphors located into these two Sanskrit terms. If we wish to employ Rūpäntar and Vivartanam as tools for revisiting the concept and practice of intersemiotic translation in Indian subcontinent, we must first unearth the botanic metaphor underlying the terms and relate them to the translational practice in pre-colonial time. Now, the third part is ecological turn. If such alternative methods of translation can be invoked based on the ecological perspective, then we are surely standing at the juncture when translation studies is taking an ecological turn. As such, I have proposed a panel in IITS this year, as mentioned by Duncan, to explore some of the most pressing questions related to the ecological turn in translatology. Keeping in mind this biological conceptualization of natural selection, evolution, and survival, can we then attempt to form an ecological model of the process of translation? Does the translator attempt to carry out both adaptive selection and selective adaptation in terms of adapting his or her body into the target socio-lingual and politico-cultural environment, as well as selecting the text for the translation eco-environment? While formulating the definition of life in the planetary systems, a committee assembled by NASA in 1994 suggested, following Carl Sagan's idea, that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of growth, replication, and Darwinian evolution. According to this definition, living species go through metabolism or chemical transformations in an environment filled with the right ingredients like water, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, and sulfur. As stated by Oparin-Haldane theory and later ratified by Miller-Urey experiment, if the fundamental inorganic molecules present on early Earth are given the right conditions, they can start interacting with each other and form organic molecules and thereafter evolves into an organism. If we consider author, language, culture, theme, genre, authorial intention, and other textual elements as organic and inorganic molecules, which by interacting with each other can form an organic text living and sustaining in its own environment, can we then consider translation of it as an evolution and adaptation in Darwinian sense, where a transformed species will evolve in a completely new experiment environment, mutating with new sets of elements, for example, translator, target language, target text, target culture, translatorial purpose. Further, borrowing John Bowlby's idea of environment of evolutionary adaptation, can we argue that often conditions present in the target environment allow a species or text to adapt into it, and for which that species and text is naturally selected for? And can we extend encoding decoding Snyder's concept beyond the linguistic realm of transferring message to the field of genetics as transformation of genetic information resulting in mutation? How should we maintain an eco-balance between two diverse ecosystems while performing the translational act? Or does the act of translation inevitably imbibe imbalance due to distinct unequal geographies bound up with asymmetrical power relations between their respective nation states? Responding from the global south to the concepts of eco-translation as proposed by Professor Cronin, I feel that the need of the hour is to find suitable answers to these questions so as to venture into this field, which is still date the least explored area in South Asia. Thank you, Duncan, and thank you to all the organizers of BCLT for giving me the space to speak my mind. And I hope that I have created some questions in the mind of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Rindon. That was a splendid presentation and a really important perspective, I think, broadening our understanding of the word translation itself. I love the opening focus on fluidity, which seemed to me to link us back to the end of Michael Cronin's paper yesterday, and his focus on the sea and the fluid. Your focus on the notion of translation in biology was reminding me of the sense that biology, in which biology uses translation, the translation of messenger RNA. It has its own sense of the term translation. I enjoyed your reference to NASA as well. It seems that in spacewalking is described as translation in by NASA, which is quite which is another expanded sense of the term. In the chat, there have been some further suggestions in response to your linguistic investigations. Could I perhaps just remind everybody to, when you're contributing to the chat, do make sure that you send your message to all panelists and attendees, and then everybody will be able to see what you are, see your comment. One or two have come through just to all panelists, and Nikita Parik suggested as a further term Bhashantar as well, but I know you were focusing just on two terms, but really the way in which you were drawing out the metaphorics, the botanical metaphorics, and thank you for linking in to Susan Bassnett as well, who we will be hearing a little later on. Thank you, Rindon, and we've got some comments coming through in the Q&A. Nikita saying that there is an argument that the differences in approaching the act of translation in the West and the East stem from the differences in core theological schemas. Unlike the Asian stroke Indian translators, the Western translators tend to focus on equivalence, much like a paradise lost that must be regained. What is your take on that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm really thankful to Nikita for bringing up this issue. This particular concept that you are talking about is linked to the anxiety of the translator in the Western sense, which we in the Indian, pre-colonial time at least, we didn't have. The problem was, has happened when the lexicographers, when they were trying to equate the terminologies, the Western concept like translation, and they are trying to find out that which particular word can substitute, and they chose anuvad. Now the problem is that, as you already know, that anuvad is a temporal concept, and it has a kind of temporality embedded into it. It's saying after, repeating. Now, therefore, in India, say for example, you can take examples of Gita or any Mahakavyas like Rama and Mahabharata, any text, Vedas. We are all, but in the pre-colonial time, we concentrated on interpretation, and that is why we have several versions. But look at to the West, the Bible, they have kept it as holy as possible, as intact as possible. So in the West, they have tried to focus on this word for word very much, rather than in India, where in the pre-colonial time at least, they were very much relied on transcreation. Another thing that that you have written in the chat, I can see this word Vashantar. Now I haven't talked about Vashantar. Why? The simple reason is that this particular word, as far as my knowledge goes, were not there in the pre-colonial time, This is a word that has been coined in the post-colonial time in order to equate this particular terminology translation. Because the post-colonial thinkers, they have understood, lexicographers especially, that there is a problem in equating translation with anuvad. So this Vashantar, which is also talking about the travel of language from one space to the other, can be equated with translation. So that is why you can see in the post-colonial time in the dictionaries, they are using Vashantar more than Anuvad. They're keeping Anuvad intact, but they're also adding Vashantar.
Thank you, Rindon. A question from Yetian. While it is fascinating to see the claim that the text, people, and the environment are an organic whole in the eco-translatology, it seems to me that the emphasis on how the environment influences translation is biased. If we indeed see all actors playing more or less an equal role in the translation process, we should go beyond the consideration of how the environment influences the replanting of the tree, but how the tree will influence the new environment in terms of species invasion, for example. Or does the environment naturally occupy a higher position in this process?
It depends on the process. Thank you for this brilliant question. I do not have a direct answer to this, but what I can say that it depends on the environment, whether this newly imported plant will survive or not in this new environment. So that depends on the process of adaptation and the process of adoption of for the plant also. Thank you for this brilliant. I'll think about it later.
Thank you. A question from Monica Mafia. I love the biological metaphor of how sciences inform the art of translation. The etymology quoted reminded me of Nabokov's idea of translation as verbal transmigration. Would you like to comment on that? So Nabokov, translation as verbal transmigration.
I'm not aware of this particular thing, but what I have tried in my paper to equate these ideas like transfer, translation, and transmigration, because they all are sharing the same root, trans, and they are also sharing the almost similar kind of concepts. So my idea is to expand the word translation from this binary of word for word and sense for sense, and to try to expand that by bringing in other sciences, other disciplines into it. And I'm heavily influenced by Michael Cronin, Susan Bassnett, and also Kobus Madai, because they have tried this for this expansion, and I'm reading them more and more in order to understand how we can take in the examples from other disciplines to in order to make sense of our translation studies.
Thank you, Rindon. It's particularly striking, the scientific references in your presentation, and I was wondering, you were presenting your contribution as a way of, in a sense, the representing a new kind of contribution from the Global South towards the development of translation studies. And I was wondering whether, to what extent you are able within, for example, within your center at Sri Sri, to develop this line of thinking, or is this something which you yourself are particularly developing? Are you finding that there is that there are other scholars who are able to take up your ideas?
First of all, this center is just 1 month old, and second, but before we started the center, what I and another professor, my MPhil supervisor from University of Hyderabad, the first center of translation in India, we have done a webinar, an international webinar, where we have invited Michael Cronin also, and we tried to expand translation studies across frontiers. So that was the title of it, and where we have invited as many as possible, the theoreticians of translation studies who have talked about, different modes of translation. Say, for example, Kobus Marai, Michael Cronin, all these people, Douglas Robinson, then Mona Baker, all these professors came in this platform and tried to because in India, still we have this particular idea about translation either from the linguistic point of view or from the comparative literature point of view. I myself, from the comparative literature, I'm a comparatist, but I am trying to expand this idea of translation studies in South Asia, at least in India, and try to follow Cronin, Marai, Mona Baker, Susan Basnet as much as possible, and Hu Gengshen and all the Chinese scholars, who are also working on eco-translation.
A question from Alpa Zafar. I believe the variety of theories mentioned have their own backgrounds. Could there be compatibility issues when they are combined in the basket of translation?
Yes, very much. That is one thing I'm still struggling with, because the kind of idea that I'm imbibing in my paper, the idea of translation, which has I'm trying to expand, and in order to expand, sometimes I'm crossing the limit. So this is something that in this compatibility issue is I'm trying to figure out how to settle in my paper, and also this, whether I should use the word metaphor or not, because all these, scientific things that I have talked about are real experiments on the real ground. So should I continue this metaphorical argument of translation, or I should delete that particular thing and say directly the biological meaning of translation, like that? So I'm still, struggling in this particular theoretical position.
Have you found that scientists, biologists, other scientists are receptive to the way in which you are using scientific ideas to broaden translation studies in the way that you've outlined? Have you found a receptive response to your ideas among scientists?
Yes, I'm actually working with a junior research fellow on zoology, who is actually helping me to understand all these biological things.
Mm.
So I'm also trying to think, as Cronin was saying yesterday, to form a group where different specialists will come and contribute to this field of study.
I was struck when I arrived at UEA by the existence of a translational fund, and I thought splendid how they've thought of us and devoted resources specifically to the kind of work that we do. But then, of course, I realized that they meant translation in a very different sense, and thinking about the translation of scientific research into practice, and particularly clinical practice. So that's something I'm hoping, it's a dialogue that I'm hoping that I can pursue at UEA as well, bridging between the arts and humanities side of campus and the scientific side. A question from Zilke Luhrmann. The concept of transplantation in particular also casts an interesting new light on historical translation practices in the global north, e.g. the importance of Shakespeare in shaping concepts of nationhood in Germany. So linking in, yes, the concept of transplantation into another very interest very close to your heart, comparative literature, and the way in which cultures borrow literary models in order then for the seeds to grow in the new soil.
I think, I'm not aware of this particular instance by example, but I think, if we start thinking translation from the other disciplinary background, if we start thinking, as you have rightly pointed out, if you just, Google the word translation, you'll see the translation exists in zoology, biology, mathematics, and other fields of study. So if we can bring in the all these knowledge system into this field, we can create different models of it. And I'm sure that this transplantation, a lot of people they have worked on it. It's not a very new thing, but yes, Rūpäntar from the transplantation point of view, I think that that's something I haven't read about.
There was a comment actually in the chat from Dalia Smelstoriute, who comments on a Lithuanian verb rūpėti, meaning to care, concern, be concerned, might be an evolution of the Sanskrit word. So taking your in a new direction.
Thank you, Dalia. I have already copied your comment in my paper. I will definitely look into this.
Shafiqi Islam says, it's interesting that you've linked translation to medical biological aspects. I was wondering if there's an expanded study on this issue.
I'm not very much aware of it.
Okay. But you yourself presumably are looking to
Yes.
expand the content of this paper into a broader study.
Exactly. This is part of my PhD thesis actually, which I'm writing now. And this platform and all these comments and will help me in shaping my thoughts in my thesis.
Eva Zeidel asks, says, thank you for your fascinating talk. Can you elaborate a bit on your stance on translanguaging?
That is another paradigm. I have read about it, but I haven't included that particular paradigm in my field of study, simply because I wanted to expand this concept of translation from the linguistic perspective. And translanguaging, yes, that can also be thought about, but I am not very sure how I can figure that particular thing in my paper.
Okay, I think we should draw things to a close at this point. Thank you, Rindon, for your answers to our audience questions as well. And thank you so much for your contribution.